Actually, these are phrases, more like phrases used to tell a story. They kind of give the reader or listener clues as to where the story is going. For example, if it's the beginning of a story, if we're going to begin a story or continue, the story's going back in another part of the story, or we're ending a story. So the first one says, "I'll never forget the time." Okay, usually someone is beginning a story when they use that expression. All right, and actually we're going to go and fill in our own box here. Okay, so you can look in your book. The next one in the yellow box, the thing you have to know is. All right, if somebody says that, we're probably most likely going back in a story because we have to explain something to help the listener or reader understand something. So you kind of go back and explain something. The thing you have to know is that I always get dizzy when I'm standing in a tall or high area looking down. So you're going back and explaining something, making it clear. All right. The next one. It all started when. Sounds like a beginning of a story to me. It all started when my friend has this crazy idea. All right, the next one. What happened was, okay, so pretty much that's continuing the story. Well, what happened was, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and then I forgot to mention that. Okay, kind of sounds like going back in a story when it says I forgot to mention something. I can't type today. All right, next column. Meanwhile. What is meanwhile? Meanwhile, back at the ranch, blah, blah, blah. That's basically continuing a story. I've got my cheat sheets just to make sure. Yes. It's almost like something else is happening at the same time in the story. When we say meanwhile, then we go to another part in the story, but it's really something that's happening at the same time that another activity is going on. Okay, meanwhile. And in the end, not too difficult to figure out. In the end, they lived happily ever after. All right. How about, that reminds me of when? Actually, that is the beginning to a story. Me of when? Because sometimes people will be talking, having a conversation, and then you say, oh, yeah, that reminds me of when I was back in high school and we used to compete with blah, blah, blah. You start talking about it because there's something that triggers a thought or a memory, and then you start talking about it. So this is usually the beginning. All right, let's see. The next thing we knew, that would be continuing a story. The next thing we knew, we were lost. Okay, how about, so later on, probably continuing a story. So later on, we decided to stop for lunch. Okay, last column. To make a long story short. To make a long story short. So you're coming to the conclusion. You're skipping a lot of details and going to the end. Does This is actually pretty common in conversation. And I'll go back and kind of tell you which ones there are very common in just everyday conversation. Because some of these you just kind of see in books or here's informal stories. Some of them we actually use. All right, the next one. I've got to tell you about. It's usually at the beginning of a story. Somebody calls, your friend calls you, oh, I've got to tell you about what happened at the party last week. Can't spell. Okay, got to tell you about starting a story. The other thing is, sounds like going back, is or was, okay. So finally, right. So finally we arrived 3 hours later. Okay, so when we're in conversation, we're actually talking to people. This one, actually, that reminds me of when. That's pretty common. I've got to tell you about, pretty common. What happened was, okay, you're going on with your story. Meanwhile, sometimes. Later on, so those are pretty common. You could even say, yeah, people say, oh, the next thing we knew, we were lost. Sometimes. Going back in a story, this is pretty common. Oh, I forgot to mention. Or the other thing was or is. So these two are very common. To make a long story short, very common to use. So finally, blah, blah, blah. That's common. So there's a few of these that are pretty common in conversations when you're, telling somebody about something. All right, so you'll have a little exercise in your workbook for these, and usually there's a couple that people kind of get confused, and that's okay. But just kind of read the story, read it all first, and read it through, and then go back and see where you would put these expressions. All right. Email me if you have any questions. Have a good day.